Today, I'm taking you through the process of remaking a song, from actively listening to identifying the song elements to remaking them. So for starters, let's take a listen to the song we're remaking today, and let's try to identify and write down any song element we hear, because before we can remake anything, we have to know what exactly to remake, right? So let's go. Start with a phasing guitar, a kick, 4 on the floor, and some hi-hats. Snare is introduced every second and fourth beat. '80s synth arpeggio. Very cool fill. Fill again. And again. And nothing. Okay. Yeah, so we have the vocals come in here, which we won't be remaking today, as well as some bass line played on a bass guitar and some rhythmic chords played on what sounds like an electric piano, like the Rhodes. Fill again. Bigger fill. And here the 80s synth from the intro is reintroduced. Snare fill. New synth, very 80s, also playing a different progression. And the bass is adjusting to this progression, which makes sense. No more snare, different bass synth, and some bells playing a higher octave. So this is the chorus, and if you listen closely, this is basically an enhanced version of the verse production with the drums, the bass, the arpeggiating 80s synth, and the Rhodes. But they add a crash, a new synth, crash again, same synth again, and then nothing. So we've identified the main elements of this song, meaning we can turn to our DAW. And I typically start by Googling the song's BPM and key, which is 121 C minor. Okay, so let's set that in our session. And next I want to visually organize all elements we just identified, and to save time I've already gone ahead. So here's what that could look like. So basically these are all the elements we just listed, like the phasing guitar, the drums, the synths, but positioned exactly at the points when they should be played in the song's arrangement. And here's what that sounds like right now. Dead silent, but the beauty is that we can now start filling in these blocks like pattern by pattern with the relevant melodies, chords, rhythms, and eventually also the right sounds. So say we want to recreate the phasing guitar. Let's just load up FL Keys to first get down the right notes, and after that we can worry about finding and mixing the sound. So the guitar uses these notes, and it basically plays a rhythm consisting of 16th notes with quite a few different velocity levels for more rhythm. Something like this. Now let's do the same thing for the other elements, for example the chords, and we would have to figure out the chord progression, right? So I've been doing this for about 14 years now, and I try to do as much by ear as possible. But if you struggle figuring out the chord progression, then I recommend using a platform like Chordify, or just turn to YouTube. So in the verse, something interesting is happening. The bass notes of the chords follow the 6/4 progression, going between C and G sharp. But the actual chords played on top of the bass line are alternating between variants of the 6 and the 4 chords, which sounds very 80s, and they're played in a cool rhythm that complements the bass line really well. Then in the pre-chorus we get rid of that cool rhythm and we go to a different progression alternating between the 5 and the 6 chords. finally ending on this borrowed chord, the 3 major. And then we go to the chorus, which uses the same chords and bass line as the verse, but we're adding a new chord element going like da 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 da, like this. And that's why we should also slightly adjust the bass line to follow this new element. And this is essentially what we want to do for each element in the remake, getting down the exact melody, chords, or rhythm without caring about the specific sound yet. For example, the 80s synth arpeggio, and the drums simply using stock samples from FL Studio's legacy packs. And that's how we end up with a very elementary yet decent outline of the song, which sounds like this. So next, let's actually start caring about the sounds, and in my opinion, this is the most fun part. So let's start with that cool phasing guitar. And from listening to the original song, it sounds like we're dealing with a muted electric guitar with some phaser or flanger effect, along with some reverb and filter automation. Now, I don't play the guitar, so our next best thing is to try a plugin or a sample library, something like Contact, like maybe the Electric Sunburst Deluxe library, which I basically use all the time. And one thing I'd like to point out is that the longer you find yourself producing, the better you will get at guesstimating which plugins or sample libraries to turn to when trying to find a certain sound. So in this case, let's load up our Contact library. Let's make sure the octave is the same as FL keys. And based on intuition, I'd add a phaser, a flanger, some reverb, and a filter. And let's create some automation clips to add this movement in the intensity of the flanger and filtering. Now, another big piece of the puzzle are the drums, and I would usually go to Splice for this, but if I didn't have Splice, then I would either try my DAW stock samples, or I would Google something like free 80s disco drum machine samples. Anyway, knowing how to describe your drums is crucial because it dramatically helps the search process. Like in this case, I would describe the drums as disco raw vintage drum machine, so those would be the keywords to look for on Splice. However, if you don't know what to search for on Splice, then I would just go to Instruments, Drums, say Kicks, if kick is what you're looking for, and use the filter view to spot any keywords that might grab your attention. Like synthwave could be relevant while we might not have thought of that ourselves. Alternatively, we can also search for the genre of the song to find relevant samples or even sample packs. In this case, the Oliver packs might be useful because they have very good 80s disco drum samples. Either way, it often comes down to browsing and auditioning a lot of different samples. And I would recommend using the Show Similar Sounds option in Splice to find samples that match your vibe once you hear something that sounds remotely close to what you're after. Either way, after quite some trial and error, here's the drum samples I landed on myself. So when it comes to synths, I generally try to redesign them myself, like take this 80s ARP for example. Now let's replace our piano with an instance of Serum, and first I always want to figure out the shape of the sound through these knobs. In this case I'm hearing quite a smooth attack with a bit of a tail at the end, so let's bring up the attack and release knobs while playing with the other knobs. Not bad. So step 2 is figuring out the wavetable, which usually takes quite a bit of browsing and testing, but I think we'll need some kind of analog saw wave here. And we'll have to turn up the number of voices to get this detuned saw sound. Slightly less detuned. And for step 3, let's enable our filter to drive and fatten up our sound a bit and roll off a little bit of those super high frequencies for a more analog sound. So as you can see, sound design can sometimes be quite easy, though admittedly it can also be very hard at times, and in those cases I would just recommend you to browse presets and tweak them. So let's hear our synth in action. And using those exact same steps, I also recreated the supersaw synths we hear in the song's chorus, which sounded like this on the piano, and like this with our synth from scratch. Now, when it comes to actual instruments like guitars, piano, bass, I typically turn to plugins that use samples like Contact, Keyscape, and Omnisphere. So the chords sound like they come from an electric piano, like a Rhodes, and I know Keyscape has a great library filled with various Rhodes samples, so let's check that out. So I found 3 contenders that all sound good, which is why I decided to use all 3 of them, keeping one in the center while using the others as layers panned hard left and right to create a wider and fuller sound. And along similar lines, I managed to find sounds for the bass, the chord synth in the pre-chorus, and the higher octave bells layer in the pre-chorus. So as you can see, a big part of remaking songs is identifying elements, knowing your plugins and sample arsenal, and in turn knowing where to look or how to design a sound, which are skills you'll develop over time. But take in mind that even after finding the right sound, it often takes a lot more tweaking, for example on the sound's mixer channels, to refine the mix and match the song we're remaking. Think about stuff like sidechaining, volume control, and EQ for elements to harmoniously fit together. And also remember that it's very, very hard to perfectly remake a song, but that is really all about the learning process, which can be very rewarding and also lots of fun. So there you have it. These were the 3 steps that could essentially be applied to remaking any song. Identify, outline, and recreate. Now, I'd love to hear about your favorite tips for remaking songs in the comments below. And remember, there's also lots of remakes on this channel like these 2 that you might enjoy. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.